My name is Simone. I'm 41 years old, and I want to tell you about the afternoon my parents showed up at the lobby of my office building in downtown Atlanta. Two people I had not seen in 22 years, standing at the reception desk with the specific discomfort of people who are accustomed to being received and are finding the receiving more complicated than they expected. And I want to tell you not just what happened in the conference room that afternoon, but everything that came before it. Because the everything before it is the only reason the afternoon means anything at all. The only reason I was sitting on the right side of that desk instead of the wrong side of a very different kind of room. I want to tell you about being 17 years old and being put out of a house in a neighborhood where the lawns were always cut and the cars were always new and the appearances were always managed with the specific discipline of people for whom appearance is the primary product. And I want to tell you about the years that followed, the streets and the shelters and the people you meet when you have nowhere else to be, and about a rehabilitation center in a building that smelled like industrial cleaner and something older underneath it, where I met a man named Darius who was 20 years old and 3 weeks clean and who looked at me across a folding table during a group session and saw something I had stopped believing was there. And I want to tell you what we built from that folding table to a company with 43 employees and a downtown office with a lobby and a reception desk, because I think that story is the one that matters, not just the confrontation at the end, but the entire arc of a life that was built by two people who had nothing and decided that nothing was a starting point and not a conclusion. If you have ever been left at your lowest by the people who were supposed to hold you, stay with me, subscribe to Unspoken Truth. And if this kind of story, a story about falling all the way down and building all the way back up, is one you need today, hit that subscribe button. Because what I said to my parents in that conference room is something I have been building toward for 22 years and I want you to hear it. I grew up in Buckhead, which is a part of Atlanta where money is not just present but architectural, where it determines the size of the gates and the height of the hedges and the particular quality of silence that expensive neighborhoods have. A silence that is not peaceful but managed. The silence of a place where noise has been priced out. My father was a real estate developer who had built his business across 20 years of the right connections and the right timing and the specific confidence of a man who had never had a serious reason to doubt himself. My mother was the kind of woman who wore her social life as a full-time occupation. The charity boards and the club memberships and the dinner parties that required 3 weeks of planning and functioned primarily as occasions for the performance of a life that looked, from the outside, like everything you were supposed to want. I was their only child, which meant I was their only opportunity and their only liability in equal measure. I had been a good student in the early years, attentive and precise, the kind of child who did well because doing well was the expected condition and not because anyone had asked me what I actually wanted. By 15 I was doing less well, not dramatically, not in a way that announced itself, but in the specific quiet way of a person who is disappearing from the inside while maintaining the exterior that is required of them. I had friends who had access to things that made the disappearing feel, temporarily, like presents, and I had made the specific and terrible mistake that teenagers make when they are lonely inside a life that looks full from the outside. I had confused the temporary feeling of presence with the thing itself. By 16 I was using regularly. By 17 it was the organizing principle of my days, everything else arranged around it. School attendance and curfews and the careful maintenance of the appearance that was the family's primary currency, all of it subordinated to the thing that had become, in the way these things become, the only thing that felt real. My grades collapsed in the second semester of junior year. I was caught at school with something I should not have had. The school called my parents. And my parents sat me down in the living room of our house in Buckhead with the specific composure of people managing a crisis and told me, in the careful language of people who had already made their decision and were delivering it rather than discussing it, that I had two options: a residential treatment program they had found in another state, a place I would be sent immediately and quietly, or I could leave. They would give me $1,000 and they were done. I want to tell you about that conversation because I think the detail of it matters. It was not a conversation that contained grief. My father did not look like a man losing his daughter. He looked like a man managing a situation. And the situation he was managing was not me but the information, where it would go, what it would mean for the family's position in a community where position was the primary currency. The residential program was not offered as help. It was offered as containment. way of making the problem invisible without the complication of me being visibly gone. And when I said I would not go, when I said I would not be sent away like something to be stored, my father nodded once and my mother looked at the table, and he went to the safe in his study and came back with an envelope, $1,000 in hundreds, and he put it on the coffee table between us and said that was all there was. I took the envelope. I went upstairs and I packed a bag with the focused efficiency of someone who has just understood that speed matters, and I walked out of that house in Buckhead with $1,000 in a bag and the specific clarity of a 17-year-old who has just had something confirmed that she had suspected for a long time, that the love in that house had always been conditional on the management of appearances, and that she had just become too expensive to manage. $1,000 lasted 3 weeks, which is longer than it sounds when you are 17 and using and living in a city that is indifferent to both conditions. I stayed in motels at first, then with people I knew from the circles I had been moving in, then in places that were not really places, the specific geography of a life lived outside the structures that most people inhabit without thinking about them. I am not going to tell you that period was romantic, or that it had the quality of a story with a clear trajectory. It did not. It had the quality of a thing that is happening to you rather than a thing you are doing. Days that blurred into each other and people who appeared and disappeared, and the specific tunnel vision of someone whose entire existence has contracted to the management of one need. I want to be honest about those years because I think honesty is the only thing that makes this story useful. I was not a girl waiting to be rescued. I was a girl who was in the process of using herself up, and I knew it, in the specific way that you know things you are not ready to act on. I knew it every morning in the particular way of someone who wakes up and takes a full inventory of what remains and finds the inventory shorter than the day before. I was 20 years old when I ended up in a shelter on Ponce de Leon. 20 years old and at the end of something. I could feel the end of it the way you feel the end of a road, not a wall, just the specific quality of a surface that is about to stop. And I was not afraid of the end the way I had been afraid of things earlier. I was tired, which is its own kind of surrender, and also, it turned out, its own kind of beginning. The shelter had a partnership with a rehabilitation center 3 miles away. A van ran between them on Tuesday and Thursday mornings. I got in the van on a Thursday in February because the woman at the shelter desk had told me 3 times in 2 days, and on the 3rd time I had been too tired to say no. The rehabilitation center was a building that had been a school at some point. The ceilings were high and the windows were large and the floors were linoleum worn smooth in the parts that people walked most often. It smelled like industrial cleaner and something older underneath it. The specific smell of a place that has held a lot of human difficulty and has kept holding it anyway. The intake process was thorough and unhurried. A woman named Denise, who had kind eyes and the specific professional calm of someone who has heard every version of every story and finds none of them disqualifying, asked me questions I answered with more honesty than I had used in years, partly because I was too tired to perform anything and partly because something in the room, the high ceilings or the worn linoleum or Denise's unhurried questions, made performance feel unnecessary. I was assigned a bed in a room with 3 other women and a counselor named Marcus who had been through his own version of what I was going through and who understood the specific grammar of it in a way that people who have not been through it cannot. And I started the process of becoming someone who was no longer disappearing. Darius was in a group session 3 weeks after I arrived, a Tuesday afternoon in March, the kind of March afternoon that cannot decide whether it is still winter or has agreed to be spring. He was sitting across the folding table from me with the specific contained energy of someone who is 3 weeks clean and is managing the managing of it. He was 20 years old. He had grown up in Decatur. He had a way of listening that was different from most people's listening. Most people listen in order to respond, but Darius listened in order to understand. You could feel the difference. It had a quality of stillness to it. And across that folding table in a room that smelled like industrial cleaner and old floors, I felt, for the first time in a long time, like someone was paying attention to the right things. We were not supposed to develop personal relationships during the program. This was a rule that existed for good reasons and that both of us understood and that neither of us violated inside the center. But when I completed the program in June and Darius completed his in July, and we both ended up at the same transitional housing facility on the east side of Atlanta, we were no longer inside the center's rules, and we had a conversation over bad coffee in the facility's common room that lasted for hours and covered the kind of ground that you only cover with someone you trust completely. and by the end of it I understood that I was not going to be doing what came next alone. What came next was not easy, and I am not going to make it sound easy. It was the specific hard work of building a life from a position that has no infrastructure, no safety net, no family home to return to if things go wrong, no connections that open doors. Just the two of us and the transitional housing and the jobs we got and kept, with the specific determination of people who understand that keeping the job is not optional because there is no alternative to the job. Darius worked in construction. I got a job at a print shop run by a man named Gerald who was 60 years old and had the particular patience of someone who has hired people in difficult circumstances before and has decided that patience is a better investment than its alternative. Gerald taught me design, not formally, just by letting me watch and ask questions and make mistakes that he corrected without making them feel like failures. And by the end of the first year I could do things on the software that Gerald said took most people 3 years to learn, which he said with the specific satisfaction of a man who has been proven right about something he bet on. Darius and I moved into our own apartment at the end of that first year, a one-bedroom on the second floor of a building in East Atlanta that had a window in the kitchen that faced east and filled up with morning light, and we paid the rent on time every month with the focused attention of people who understand that the rent being paid on time is not a small thing but a large one. It is the thing that means you are still here, still building, still on the right side of the line. And we treated it accordingly. We treated every small stability as the large thing it actually was because we had been on the other side of it and we knew the difference. I started doing freelance design work in the evenings, small jobs at first, a logo for a restaurant, a flyer for a community event, the specific entry-level work of someone building a portfolio from zero. Darius started picking up project management work on the side. He had a mind for logistics, for the sequencing of things, for understanding which piece needs to be in place before the next piece can move. And by the end of the second year we were making more from the side work than from their primary jobs, which was information we looked at together at the kitchen table one Sunday morning and understood meant something. We got married on a Saturday in October at the Decatur courthouse with Darius's mother and Gerald and 2 friends as witnesses. No reception. A dinner afterward at a restaurant that had good food and low lighting and that we had been saving toward for 2 months. I wore a dress I had bought at a consignment shop and altered myself. Darius wore a suit he had owned since the transitional housing and had kept in good condition with the specific care of someone who owns one good thing and understands its value. His mother cried during the ceremony with the quality of a woman crying for more than one reason. And I held Darius's hand and thought, this is the most real thing I have ever been part of. This specific ordinary courthouse moment is the realest thing. The business started as a design and project management consultancy, which sounds more organized in retrospect than it felt at the time. At the time it felt like 2 people taking on every piece of work they could find and doing it well enough that the people who hired them told other people, which is the only marketing that actually works. We worked from the apartment for the first 2 years and then from a shared office space and then from a small office of our own in a building in Decatur that had good light and was affordable and that we treated with the same care we had always treated the things we were building, because we had learned early that the things you take care of are the things that last. By the time I was 30 the business had 12 employees and a reputation in Atlanta's design and development community that had been built entirely on the quality of the work and the reliability of the people doing it. Darius ran operations with the specific precision of someone who has always understood that execution is where ideas either become real or don't. And I ran creative with the specific focused energy of someone who spent years having nothing to channel and has found, finally, the right channel. We were good together in the way that people are good together when they have been through something real and have come out of it with a shared understanding of what matters and what doesn't. The business was an expression of that understanding as much as it was a commercial enterprise. By the time I was 35 we had 28 employees and had moved into a larger space downtown. By the time I was 40 we had 43 employees and a lobby with a reception desk and a conference room with a table that seated 12 and a view of the city that on clear mornings had a quality that still, after 6 years in that space, made me stop for a moment when I walked past it, not from pride exactly, from something quieter, from the specific feeling of a person who can see clearly from where she is standing and remembers, with full precision, every step of the distance traveled. I had not thought about my parents in the way that you think about people who are present in your life. They had been present in my history and absent from my present for 22 years. I did not carry them as a wound exactly. The wound had become something else over time, had been metabolized into the precision with which I worked and the care with which I loved and the specific understanding I had of what it means to be supported by someone at your lowest because I had been supported by someone at my lowest, and I knew the value of it in a way that people who have not needed it cannot fully know. I did not think about my parents often, but when I did, I thought about them with the clarity of someone who has processed something fully and arrived at a place of understanding that is not the same as peace, but is not the same as pain either. It is simply seeing clearly, and seeing clearly is enough. The call came on a Tuesday. My assistant told me there were 2 people in the lobby asking for me. She said they were family. I sat with that word for a moment and then I said, send them to the conference room and I will be there in 5 minutes. And I took those 5 minutes not to compose myself but to complete myself, to stand in my office with the view of the city and remember exactly who I was and how I had gotten here. And then I walked down the hall to the conference room. They were smaller than I remembered, which is what happens to people when you stop seeing them through the eyes of the child who needed them. My father was 71. He had the specific quality of a man whose confidence has been interrupted by circumstances he did not plan for. The suit was good but not new. The watch was the watch I remembered, but it was working harder now, carrying more of the weight of the impression. My mother was 68 and she had the particular contained expression of a woman who has prepared something to say and is managing the managing of it with the discipline she has always applied to the management of appearances, except that the discipline was thinner now. I could see through it in a way I had not been able to when I was 17. I could see the thing underneath it, which was not cruelty and was not indifference but was fear, the specific fear of people who have organized their entire lives around a position that no longer exists. I sat down across from them. I did not offer coffee. I did not make the conversational moves that smooth the entry into a difficult conversation. I sat down and I looked at them and I waited, because it was their visit and their need and their move. And I had learned a long time ago that waiting is not weakness, it is information, and the information I got from watching them settle into the quiet of having to begin was useful. My father began. He said things I had expected him to say. The business had not survived the market changes of the past several years. The investments that had seemed solid had not been solid. The apartment they were in was beyond what they could sustain. They had heard about the company, about what Darius and I had built. They were not asking for a handout, he said. They were asking for help. The specific language of people who have decided that reframing the ask makes the asking easier. And I let him finish, all of it, the full careful construction of it. And when he was done I said, I want to tell you something before I tell you what I can offer you. And his face did the thing that faces do when they are expecting one conversation and are about to have a different one. I said, I was 17 years old and I was using and I was losing myself and I came to you because I needed help and you gave me $1,000 and told me you were done. I said it without anger. I had spent a long time arriving at the place where I could say it without anger, and the place I had arrived at was not forgiveness exactly but something adjacent to it. The understanding that the people across from me had made a decision from inside a value system that was broken and that their brokenness of the value system was not an excuse but it was an explanation. And I had decided a long time ago that I was going to hold the explanation without releasing the accountability. I said, I spent 3 years on the streets of this city. I said, I was 20 years old when I got into a rehabilitation program and met the man who is now my husband. And I said, everything in this building, every employee, every account, every piece of work we have ever done, was built by 2 people who had nothing, who had been left with nothing, who decided that nothing was a starting point. My mother's eyes were wet. She had not spoken yet. She was looking at me with the specific expression of someone who is seeing something they have been not seeing for a long time and is finding the seeing more difficult than the not seeing had been. My father was very still. I said, I want to tell you something else, something I have thought about for a long time, something I need you to hear before this conversation goes any further. I said, I am grateful. And I watched both of their faces do something unexpected. The surprise of people who came prepared for one kind of accounting and are receiving a different kind entirely. I said, not grateful for what you did. I want to be clear about that. What you did was abandon your daughter at the worst moment of her life. And I am not going to dress that as a gift, but I am grateful for what it made necessary. I said, "When you gave me that envelope and told me you were done, you made it necessary for me to find out whether I could survive without you. And the answer turned out to be yes, more than yes. And I would not know that answer if you had not forced the question." I said, "You did not intend to give me that, you intended to protect your reputation. But what you actually gave me, without meaning to, was the necessity of finding out who I was when there was no one left to perform for. And who I was turned out to be someone I'm glad to be, so I am grateful for the necessity even though I do not forgive the intention." The room was very quiet. My father put his hand over his mouth. My mother was crying now, not the managed crying of a woman performing an emotion, but the real kind, the kind that arrives before the performance has time to organize itself. And I looked at both of them and I felt something that I had not expected to feel in this room. I felt, beneath the clarity and the accountability, a specific and uncomplicated sadness for them, not for what they had done but for what they had missed. 22 years of missing. 22 years of a daughter who was building something extraordinary and a son-in-law who had been building it alongside her, and they had not been present for any of it because they had chosen a reputation over person and the reputation had not held. I said, "I am not going to help you financially. I want to be honest with you about that." I said, "Not because I cannot and not because I want you to suffer, but because writing a check is the thing that would let both of us walk out of this room without having had the real conversation. And I think we have needed the real conversation for 22 years. I said, "What I can offer you is this. I can be present in the way that I was not able to be when I was 17 and you were managing appearances instead of parenting a child. I can have dinner with you. I can call. I can be the daughter I would have been if the house I grew up in had been built on something more solid than what it was built on. But I cannot be that daughter and also be the one who solves the financial problem. Because those two things cannot exist in the same relationship. One of them requires you to see me clearly and the other one lets you see me as a resource. And I have been a resource to no one for a very long time and I am not going back to that." My father said, very quietly, "We made a terrible mistake." And I looked at him and I thought about a living room in Buckhead and an envelope on a coffee table and a bag packed with the focused efficiency of someone who has just understood that speed matters. And I thought about the van on Thursday morning and the folding table and Darius across it with his specific quality of listening. And I thought about the apartment with the east-facing kitchen window and Gerald and the print shop and their courthouse in October and 43 employees and the view from the conference room on clear mornings. And I said, "Yes, you did." And I said it without cruelty and without satisfaction, just with the simple clarity of a true thing stated between people who now both know it is true. They left an hour later. My father shook my hand at the door. It was not the handshake of a man being formal. It was the handshake of a man who does not yet know how to be what he needs to be and is using what he has. And I took it because it was offered in the right spirit even if the form was wrong. My mother hugged me, briefly, and I let her, because the hug was real in a way that the managed performances of my childhood had not been, and real, even when it is insufficient, is worth acknowledging. Darius was in his office when I came back. He looked up and said, "How are you?" And I sat in the chair across from his desk and said, "Clear," which was the true answer and the complete one. He nodded because he knew what clear meant and he knew what it had cost to get there. He had been in his own version of the same room, with his own version of the same accounting, and he understood the specific weight of arriving at the end of something you have been carrying for a long time. My parents call now, once a week on Sunday evenings. My father asks about the business in the specific way of a man who is learning to be interested in something for its own sake rather than for what it reflects on him. My mother asks about Darius and asks about the employees and asked once about Gerald, the man from the print shop. And I told her Gerald had retired to Savannah and was growing tomatoes and she said that sounded right, somehow. And I said yes, it does. And we sat with that for a moment in the specific comfortable quiet of people who are learning, slowly and without a roadmap, what they are to each other now. It is not the relationship I would have chosen if I had been given a choice at 17, but I was not given a choice at 17, and the life I built from the absence of that choice is not a consolation prize, it is the thing itself, it is the whole thing, and I hold it with both hands. I think about the Thursday morning van sometimes, the van that ran between the shelter and the rehabilitation center, the specific quality of that February morning, cold and flat and completely without promise. and I think about the specific tiredness that got me into that van. The tiredness of someone who has arrived at the end of the road and has decided, without drama, without announcement, simply because there is nothing else, to stop. And I think about how the stopping was the beginning. How the end of the road turned out to be a folding table and a man who listened in order to understand, and a room that smelled like industrial cleaner and old floors, and the specific possibility of a life that had not yet been built. Everything I have was built on the other side of that van ride, on the other side of the stopping. Every employee and every account, and every morning with the east-facing light, and every Sunday call, and the specific hard-won clarity of a woman who knows exactly what she is worth because she has been in the rooms where worth is not assumed but earned, one day at a time, one decision at a time, one folding table at a time. My name is Simone. I'm 41 years old, and my parents put me out at 17 with $1,000 and the belief that I was a problem to be managed. And I want to tell you that the most important thing they ever gave me was the necessity of finding out who I was without them. Because who I was turned out to be someone who could build something real, and I would not have known that if they had not made knowing a necessary. The view from my office is still extraordinary on clear mornings, and I still stop for a moment when I walk past it, not from pride, from gratitude, the specific gratitude of someone who knows exactly what the distance looks like because she walked every step of it. Thank you for listening. Take care of yourself. And remember, sometimes the door that closes on you is not the end of the story, it is the moment the real one begins.